This lesson is titled Absolute Value. Absolute value is a tricky one. A lot of people just think, oh yeah, it's the opposite, or it's always positive, but that's not quite always true. So basically what absolute value means is the distance from zero on a number line. And the way you see absolute value is these two straight bars like that. Anytime you have a number inside those straight bars, it's saying they want to find the absolute value. So right here we would say the absolute value of 5, or the absolute value of -5. And be careful, because when there's the little lines on the side, now those are brackets, that's completely different. So it has to be the perfectly straight lines. So what we're doing, whenever you see those bars, is they're saying how many spaces from 0 on the number line. And remember, as we go to the right on the number line, our numbers are positive. As we go to the left from 0, our numbers are always negative. So now as we actually solve some problems, they're asking right here, when I see those straight bars, remember they're asking for the absolute value of 5. And remember, absolute value is distance from 0. So they're just saying, how many spaces does it take to get from 0 on the number line to 5? Well, if I count that, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces in between 0 and 5. So the absolute value of 5 is just 5. And I know that seems kind of redundant, but then they get into some negatives. This is where people get tricked a little bit. The absolute value of -5, remember, they're still just asking the number of spaces from 0. So if I start at 0 on my number line, and I want to get to -5, I'm still just counting the number of spaces to get to 0. So from -5, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces in between -5 and 0. So the absolute value of -5 is also just 5. Then as we move on, we get a little more complicated. This is when we get into algebra. This stuff is more 7th grade. It's probably review. But as we get into algebra, now we have those silly variables, right? I know it freaks you out, but just follow the rules of absolute value and it's really not that bad. Now what they're saying is the absolute value of n is equal to 5. So right here, when they give you an equals, they're saying it is 5 spaces. So they want to know what numbers can go inside those absolute value bars, and it is 5 spaces from 0. Well, we actually just worked that out right here. The absolute value of 5 is 5, and the absolute value of -5 is 5. But all they're asking for right here is, what is that number inside? So we had a 5 inside the absolute value bars, and we had a -5 inside the absolute value bars. So n can actually equal a +5 or -5. The way we write that is this little symbol right here. We have a positive or a negative. We say that as plus or minus 5. Now let's get into some trickier problems. So if you remember from order of operations, when we learned about GEMDAS, I said that absolute value bars is a type of grouping. So anytime you have a problem that has absolute value bars within the problem, you have to do that part first, because that's a grouping. So on this problem, it's kind of tricky, because right here we have absolute value bars and we have a negative. And people kind of think of those as together, but remember that absolute value bar is a grouping. So we're going to cover this negative up first, and we have to do that grouping first. And the absolute value of 3, remember the number of spaces from 0, if I'm going from 0 to 3 on a number line, I just get 3 spaces. But I can't forget that negative. So if the negative is on the outside of the absolute value bars, we bring that down, and my answer becomes -3. So that's where people get mixed up, because they think absolute value, they always put a positive. But when the negative's on the outside, it comes at the end, and it actually makes your whole answer negative. Similar to that is this problem right here. I know with integers you learned a negative times a negative becomes a positive. So when you have this with parentheses, those two negatives cancel out and become positive. The problem is we don't have parentheses here. We have the absolute value, which again is the grouping. So we have to do that part first. And if I'm looking on a number line from 0 to -2, I have 2 spaces. So the absolute value of -2 is +2. But don't forget, after we take the absolute value, we still have that negative, which actually makes this whole answer -2. So it doesn't matter what's inside those absolute value bars. If the negative's on the outside, your final answer is going to be a negative. So now let's get to a little more complicated problem. Now we have a bunch of different absolute values. Well, remember, it's still just GEMDAS. So let's still follow that checklist. The first thing we have to look for is any grouping. Well, here's absolute value bars, so that's a grouping. Here's absolute value bars, so that's a grouping. And here's absolute value bars, so that's also a grouping. Right here, we just have to take the absolute value of -5. Remember, we did that in the second example. From 0 to -5, it's just 5 spaces from 0. Inside this grouping bar, 3 plus 1 is 4. But it's inside that absolute value bar. And then the absolute value of 4 is still just 4. Over here, the 2 is touching on the outside of the absolute value bar. So first we have to take this absolute value, and the absolute value of 3 is just 3. But this 2 is touching on the outside. Does it make 23? That's the tricky spot. Remember, when they're touching with a parentheses, an absolute value bar, any of those things, touching really means multiply. So 2 times that 3 really becomes 6. But don't forget, in between we have these little signs. We have our plus sign there, and we have our minus sign there. Now, this becomes my new problem. Well, my grouping is done, I don't have any exponents, I did my multiplication, so the last step is just adding and subtracting. 5 plus 4, well, you should know that, we get 9. But then what do we still have over here? We still have that -6. And 9 minus 6 gets us our final answer of a +3.